The older matters which had made the sculpture stream and bas relief so significant to my uncle's formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Engels had seen the hellish outline of the nameless monstrosity puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard of the anomalous syllables which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this in so stirring and horrible a connexion that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Engel, as befitted one of his authorities and maintenance, had a permanent, prominent part in all of the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of this convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solutions. Chief of those outsiders in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting was a commonplace looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by professions an inspector of police. With him he bore the subject of his visit, the Jurassic, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at loss to determine. It must not be financed that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, he wished for enlightenment. Enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, the idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured by some months before in a wooden swamp south of New Orleans during the raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. And so singular and hideous were the writs connected with it that the police couldn't but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Of its origin apart from the eric and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing to be discovered. Hence, the anxiety of the police for any accuriation lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for this sensation, which his offering created. One sight of a thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into the state of tense intensive excitement. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of a thing has been enough to throw the Sambo's men of science into the state of intense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around them to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and other and genuinely abyssal inquity hinted so poetry at unopened and archaic visits. No recognized schools of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed record in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. It's been like thousands of years since it happened. The figure which was finally pressed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 or 8 inches in height, of unquestionably arctic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthromoid outline, but with an octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body that protects its claws on hand and forefoot, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seems instinct with a fearsome and unnatural megalantricity, was a somewhat bloated Copernicus and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wing touched on the back of the edge of the block. The seat occupied the center, while the long, curved claws of the double up crouching behind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of a way down towards the bottom of the pedestals. The Culopto head was bent forward, and so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the back of huge forepaw, which helps the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abominably lifelike and a more stubbornly fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and inclusive age of something was unmistakable. Yet not one link did it shoe with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time, totally separate and apart. Its very matterable was a mystery, for a soapy greenish blockstone with its green or irisate flakes and extractions resembled nothing familiar to geology and mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite the reputations of a half-world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notions of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They liked the subject and material belonging to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it. something frightfully suggestive of an old and unhallowed circles of life in which of our worlds and our conceptions have no parts. And yet, as members severely shook their heads in confused defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man that's gathering who suspected a touch of a bizarre familiarity in the mo- monstrous shapes and writing, and who was presently told with some difference of an odd trifle he knew. The person was the late William Chimney Webb, professor anthropology in Princeton University, an explorer of a no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions, which he failed to unearth. And while this high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of the degenerate Equismics, whose religion, a curious form of the devil worship, called him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. Is a faith of other Equismics knew little, and which they mention only with shudders, saying that it had came down horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rates and human sacrifice, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil or Tornusk. And Professor Webb had taken a careful poetic copy of from the age Enoch or Wizard Priest, expressing the sounds in the Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now the prime significance was fetish which was Colt had cherished, and around which they danced when Aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was had cherished. It was the professor started. It was a professor stated, a very cruel bas relief of stone, compressing a hideous picture of and some cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was rough parallel in all ancestral features of a bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This data received with suspensions and astonished by the assembled members provided doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse. And he began at once to apply his informant with questions, having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swept cold worshippers his men had arrested. He besought the professor to remember as best he might the symbols taken down amongst the deliberate equinox. There then followed an exhaustive compression of details and a moment of really awed silence when both detective and scientists agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals, so many words of distance apart? What in substance, both in the Quemu wizards and the Louisiana swamperst had chanted to their own kinward idols was something very like this. The world divisions being guessed from the traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud. Pengulu Gwenwala Cthulhu Relay Gwegarhigan Figan. Legrasse had once point in advance of Professor Webb for several among his mongrel prisoners, had repeated to him what older celebrants told him the words meant. This text has ran something like this. In his house, a Legrasse dead Cthulhu awaits dreaming. And now, in responses to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legrasse related as fully as possible his experiment with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attach profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of mythmaker and therapeutics, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half crazes and paradoxes as might be least expected to process it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to the New Orleans police and frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive, but good-natured descendants of Lafayette's men's, were in a group of stark terror from the unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. And some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom, or malevolent tom, had begun its increasing beating far within the back-haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and narrowing screams, soul-chilling chants, and dancing devil flames. And the frightened messenger added the people could stand it no more. So the body of the 20 police, fitting two carriages and an automobile, and had set out in the late afternoon with a shivering squatter as the guide. At the end of a passable road, they enlightened and for miles splash on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and manglings, hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then the pile of dark, dank stones, a fragment or fragments of a rotting wall, insignificant by its hits and morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus it's like contained combined to create. I live in squatter settlements A miserable huddle of hunts, hove in sights. Hysterical dwellers ran out of a ran out to cluster around a group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beats of toms was now faintly audible far ahead, and a crueling shriek came in the frequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night, reluctant even to be left alone again. Each one of those cowed squatters refused point blank to advise another inch towards the sense of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19th collegeness pledge on unguarded into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one of the traditionally evil, reputable, and substantially unknown, and traversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white polybius thing with luminous eyes, and squatter whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of a caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They say it had been there before de Libreville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before the whole scene beats and birds and woods and birds of the woods. It was a nightmare itself, and to see it was to die, and it made a man's dream. And so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orderly was indeed on the merest fringe of this abhorred area. But that location was bad enough, hence perhaps the place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noise heard by Legrasse man as they plowed on through the black morass towards the red glare and muffled toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to man and vocal qualities peculiar to beast. It is horrible to hear the ones when the source yield the other. Animal fury and orgastic lances here wimp themselves to dehamic heights by howl and squeaking escus that tore and reverberated through those night woods like processional tempest from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized utilization will increase, and from what seems a well-drilled chorus of horror's voice would rise in a sing-along chant that hideous phrase of the ritual. Pangalu Manguath, Chahulu, with what God let different. Then the man, having reached the spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the speckle itself. Four of them reeled, one fainted, and two were shaken in a form a cry which of the mad confoundably of an eulogy fortunately the deadening. Legrasse dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In the natural glide of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre instant, clear of trees, and tolerably dry. On this now leap and twisted more indescribable hordes of human abnormally than any but the sim of a or an emigrant could paint, void of clothing. This hybrid spawn were berating, bellowing, and whirling about an monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rift in the certain of flames, stood a great granite monolith some 8 foot in height, on top of which, in Gerositas, in which its diminutiveness rested obnoxious carven statuettes from a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals, with a flame girl monolith as sentry hung, head downward, and oddly merry bodies of a helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle of the ring of the worshippers jumped and roared, and the general directions of the mass motions being from left to right in endless vocational between the rings of bodies and the rings of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been the only echoes that which includes one of the men, an excitable spinnerets, to fancy he had ephemeral responses to the ritual from some far and unilluminated spot deeper within the woods of ancient legendary and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved districtly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hit of the faint beating of the great wings and the glance of the shining eyes and the mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much naive superstitious. Actually, the horrified pause of the man was of comparatively brief duration. Duty comes first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, the police related in their forearms and plunged determinedly into an obnoxious and merciless rout. For 5 minutes, the result din and chaos behind the description, while blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legrasse was able to count some 45 solution prisoners, whom he forced in dress of haste and fall into line between two rows of four policemen. Five of worshippers lay dead, and two severely wounded. One of the was carried away and improved with stenches by their fellow prisoners. The image of on the Malaroff, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legrasse. Examined at headquarters after the trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to the men of a very low, mixed blood and mentally aberrant type. Most of the seamen and a sprinkling of Negroes and Lubitimos, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, gave a coloring of the voodooism to the heritage cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something that far deeper and older than natural fetishism was involved, degraded and ignorant as they were. The creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worship, and so they said, the old great ones who lived ages before there were many men and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea. And under the sea. But their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first men who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great press Cthulhu from his dark house in the mighty city of Relea under the waters should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to apprehend him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There were secrets which even torture couldn't extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among this conscience thing on earth, where shapes come out of the dark to visit the faithful view. But there were not the old great ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writings now, but things were told by a word of mouth. The chanted ritual wasn't the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whisper. The chant meant only this: in his house, I relay a dead old Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to vicious institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders and reverted that the killing had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in a haunted woods. But if those mysterious allies with no coherent account could ever be grand, what the police did extract came mainly from an immense aged minstrel named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talk about with undying leaders of the cults of in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legends that peeled the speculations of theophysics and made man and the world seem recent and transcend indeed. There have been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had great cities. Reminds of them. He said the deathless Chinaman had told him were still to be found in Cyclopean stories on the island in the Pacific. They all died vast approach of time before men come. But there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come around again to the right positions in a circle of eternity. They had indeed came themselves from the stars and brought their image with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, they were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shapes, for didn't this star-fashioned image approve it? But that shape wasn't made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they couldn't live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in Stonehouse in their great cities of Relea, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for the glorious resurrection. When the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at the time some force from outside must serve to deliberate. Then their bodies, the spells that preserve them intact likewise. Prevented them from making an interior move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think while this uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talk in their tubes when, after infinites of chaos, the first man came. The great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult of round small idols, which the great ones shrew them. Idols brought them in dim areas in the dark from the dark stars. The cold would never die until the stars came right again. And the secret persons would take great Cthulhu from his tube and revive his subjects and resume his role of Earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have became the great old ones, free and wild and beyond great good or evil, with laws and morals thrown aside and all men shouting and killing and revealing in joy. Then the deliberate old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and veil and enjoy themselves. All the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rates, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth a prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen man had talked with the entubed old ones in dreams. But then something had happened. The great stone city Relea, with its monolithic sculptures, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters filled one of the primeval mystery through which not even though thought they can pass had cut off the spectral intercourse, but memory never died. And the high priestess said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. They came out of the earth, and the black spirits of earth, boldly and shadowy and full of the dim rumors picked up in carvings beneath forgotten sea bottoms. Both of them, old Castro dared not to speak much. He cut himself off hurried, and no amount of persuasions of subtlety could elect more in this direction. The seas of the old ones, too. He, curious, declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he had thought the century lay amid the pathless deserts of Abera, where Iram, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult and was very unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it. Through the darkness, Chinamen said that there was a double meanings in the Nicaraguan of the mad Arab, Matthew Alazard, which they inherited, might read as they choose, specifically the much discussed couplet. This is not that which can interlie, and with strange eons, even death may die. Legrasse, deeply impressed, and not little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning her historic affiliations of the cult. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities at Trinity University could shed no light upon either cult or image. And now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than a Greenland tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest arose at the meeting by the Legrasse's tale, collaborated as it was by the statuette. Its accurate is a Saquarian correspondence of those who attended, though although some mention occurs in the formal publications of the society. Caution is the first care of those accustomed 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 to face occasional charity and imposture. Legrasse for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but not at the letter's death. It was returned to him and remains in his possessions, where I viewed it not long ago. It was surely a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to a dream sculpture of a young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculpture, that I didn't wonder. For what thoughts must arise upon hearing, after a knowledge of what Legrasse had learned of the cult, of a sense of young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphic, hieroglyphics of the swamp found image and the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least three of his precious world of the formula uttered like Equestimu Delabris and the mongrel Louisianians. Professor Engels instead started on investigations on the uttermost throughtness was entirely natural. Although privately, I suspect the young Wilcox of having heard of the cult of some indirect ways and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narrative and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroborations, and the rationalism of my mind and the extravagances of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible of my mind so conclusions. So after thoughtfully studying the manuscript again and correcting etheroscopical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative Legrasse, I made a trip to Provence to see the sculpture to give it the rebook thought proper for, so badly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone in the further left building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of a 17th century Bruton architecture which flaunts its stoicoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses of the ancient hill, under the very shadow of the forest Georgian temple in America. I found him work at work in his room. I found him at work in his room, and at once conceded from the specimen scholar about that his genius is indeed profound in mathematics. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great descendants. He has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in the marble those nightmares. Emphasis with Arthur McKean evokes in process. and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt as inexpect, he turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncles had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams, yet had never explained for the reason for the study. I didn't enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but thought, with some stubbornly to draw him out. In a short time, I became convinced of his absolute centrally, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They had found subconscious residuum and influenced his art profoundly, and he shewed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with the potency of its black suggestions. He couldn't recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream bas relief. But the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was, no doubt, the giant's shape. He had raved of an delirium that he really knew nothing of the well, hidden cult. Save from what my uncle's relentless casualism had let fall, he soon made clear, and again I strove to think some way in which he could possibly have received in a weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the deep cyclone city of slimy green stone, whose geometry, he oddly said, all wrong. But, and here with frightened, was all wrong, and here with frightened, especially the keyless, the senseless, have mental calling from underground, Cthulhu frightened, Freudian, Cthulhu frightened. These words had formed part of the dread ritual which told of the dead Cthulhu's dreams ritual in the stone vaults of Relay, and I felt deeply moved, despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult of the same casual way, and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imaging, later by virtue of its sheer impressiveness. It had so that his impostures upon my uncles had been very innocent ones. The youth was of a type at once slightly affected, slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admitting both of his genius and honesty. I took leave of him amorously and wished him all the success his talent promises. The matter of a course still remained to fancy me, and at times I had visions of personal frame for research of its origin on connections. I visited I visited New Orleans, talked with Legrasse and others of that old-time raiding party. Saw the frightful image and even questioned such of a what now heard so graphically. At first handed though, it was really no more than the detailed confirmation of secret confirmation of what my uncle had written excited me afresh. For I felt sure I was on the track of a real, very real secret and a very real ancient religion, though whose those discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of those absolute memorism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with almost expectable perseverity the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Engel. One thing I begin to suspect, which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from the ancient waterfort, swarming with foreign mongrels. After a careless push from the Negro sailor, I didn't forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and wouldn't be surprised to learn the secret methods and poison needles as ruthless as anciently known as the cryptic rituals and beliefs, known as cryptic rates and beliefs. Legrasse and his men, is it true, have been let alone, but at no rate a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not be deeper inquiries of my uncle's after encountering the sculpture data had come to sinister ears. I think Professor Engel died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go, as he then remains to be seen, for I have learned so much of it now.